What if the most brilliant victory in military history began with a plan so outrageous that even the commander's own officers begged him to abandon it? What if the only reason it worked was because everyone believed it couldn't? This operation, later celebrated as a masterstroke of psychological warfare, started as nothing more than a joke whispered through the ranks until the joke shattered one of the most secure fortresses ever built without a single shot fired. For generations, the fortress loomed over the landscape like an iron guardian. Thick stone walls, overlapping fields of fire, elevated battlements, underground magazines, reinforced gates. It was the kind of stronghold designed not just to resist attack, but to humiliate anyone foolish enough to try. Armies had wasted thousands of men attempting to breach it. Others had surrendered before even reaching its shadow. It was the definition of impenetrable, a symbol of absolute defensive power. And that was exactly the problem. The commander assigned to capture a town officer known for defying convention understood a truth his peers refused to see. Fortresses don't fall because of their walls. They fall because of the human mind strapped behind them. While his generals demanded artillery, siege towers, and a full frontal assault, he quietly sketched a plan built not on firepower, but on psychology, deception, and controlled chaos. A strategy so unorthodox that one colonel famously spat, "Only an idiot would attempt this." Another officer wrote in his diary, "It is a disgrace. He will get us all killed." Yet he didn't flinch. He knew something they did not. The defenders had spent decades believing they were invincible, decades relying on familiar patterns, predictable routines, rigid orders. And those routines, once understood, could be manipulated. What no one imagined was how far he was willing to go to bend those routines until they cracked, while the high command mocked his refusal to mobilize. Artillery. He focused on observation, studying guard rotations, lantern signals, supply patterns, weather changes, psychological fatigue. His scouts reported that the fortress ran like a machine, but machines break when the pressure becomes unpredictable. All he had to do was introduce a kind of pressure they had never trained for. He began subtly, small disturbances just beyond the walls. Strange sounds carried on the wind, movements glimpsed at the tree line, disappearing footprints in the mud, light signals at odd hours. Nothing harmful, nothing clear, nothing the defenders could classify as a threat. And that ambiguity was the point. Soldiers can endure hunger, cold, and even hopeless odds. But uncertainty, that corrodes discipline faster than gunfire. Within days, the garrison started reporting inconsistencies. Patrols swearing they heard whispers in the dark, sentries insisting they saw silhouettes that vanished when approached, watchmen claiming objects had shifted positions. Overnight, officers dismissed the reports as nerves until their own headquarters began receiving conflicting messages from within the walls, each blaming a different internal unit for lapses that no one could explain. The commander amplified this tension with precision. He altered the pattern every night, never repeating a single tactic, ensuring that the defenders could never adapt. Some nights were silent, others were filled with faint metallic echoes. Once, he had a small detachment walk in, slow formation with torches far from the walls, giving the illusion of a massive force assembling. The defenders panicked, increasing their watch hours, exhausting themselves, losing their sense of stability. And as exhaustion grew, doubts followed. Doubt about their commander, doubt about their security, doubt about one another. The brilliance of his strategy wasn't in creating fear. Any army can do that. It was in creating fear without an enemy, fear without a target, fear that came from inside the minds of the defenders, not from outside the walls. Because when a fortress becomes afraid of its own shadow, when its defenders no longer trust their senses, it is already half defeated. The officers who had laughed at the plan were no longer laughing. They were watching something impossible unfold. A fortress famous for its discipline was unraveling, not from artillery or assault, but from psychological fractures the commander had engineered one silent night at a time. And yet, for all his progress, the operation had barely begun. The real turning point, the moment when the defender's certainty would collapse, was approaching. And to trigger it, he would have to push his deception to an entirely new level, one so audacious that even he questioned whether it would work. Before we move deeper into the operation and uncover how a single commander managed to fracture the will of an entire garrison, I need to ask you one thing. What part of this unfolding strategy surprised you the most so far? Your comment helps us understand how you interpret these psychological maneuvers, and it also tells the algorithm that this kind of historical analysis matters. If you're absorbing the details, catching the subtle clues hidden in the narrative, or realizing just how fragile even the strongest fortress can be when the mind turns against itself, then make sure you leave a like. It lets the platform know you're following this investigation closely, and it ensures that more people interested in military history, battlefield psychology, and covert tactics will discover this story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. These videos dive into strategies and moments that most history books skip entirely. Subscribing ensures you never miss the next turning point, the next unexpected tactic, or the next unraveling of a myth that shaped the course of a war. Long before the commander arrived with his unconventional ideas, the fortress had already earned a reputation that bordered on myth. It was more than a structure. It was a symbol carved into the imagination of every soldier who ever marched within sight of its walls. Armies feared it. Commanders avoided it. War historians wrote about it as if it were a beast rather than a building. Those who defended it believed they lived inside the safest place ever constructed by human hands, and that belief, more than any wall or cannon, was the true foundation of its strength. The fortress was positioned on high ground, surrounded by steep terrain that funneled attackers into predictable kill zones. Narrow approaches forced invading columns to bunch together, making them easy targets for archers, rifles, or artillery, depending on the era. Beneath the surface, tunnels connected inner courtyards, allowing defenders to move supplies and troops without being exposed. Every gate was reinforced with layered timber and iron, and each tower had overlapping fields of view, eliminating blind spots. Even the wind worked in their favor, carrying sound upward so sentries could hear movement long before attackers reached the outer walls. It was, by all metrics, a nightmare to capture, and that is exactly why no one questioned its invincibility. Over decades, countless generals had simply marched past it, choosing not to sacrifice their men against such impossible odds. Stories of failed assaults became cautionary tales told in military academies. Veterans whispered about the fortress that kills armies. The very sight of it was enough to drain courage from even the most seasoned units. When a location builds a legend like that, it stops being a tactical obstacle and becomes a psychological one. But in war, invincibility creates its own weakness. A fortress that never falls begins to believe it never can. Its defenders become rigid, predictable, confident in the idea that their enemies will never dare approach. They rely on established routines because those routines have always worked. And any routine, no matter how strong, can be exploited once an enemy understands it deeply enough. This was the truth the commander saw long before anyone else. While his peers focused on walls, cannons, and battlements, he focused on the people inside them, their habits, their assumptions, their blind trust in their routines passed down through generations. His reconnaissance teams reported the same phrase over and over: they don't expect anything. Not because they were lazy, but because decades of dominance had shaped their thinking. When you live inside something believed to be unbreakable, you stop imagining what real danger feels like. He studied the fortress 4 days, mapping guard rotations, noting the times when patrols intersected, observing which sections of the wall were watched more closely during daylight than at night. He discovered that the defenders were exceptionally disciplined, but disciplined in a way that bordereth on mechanical. The same lanterns were lit at the same hours. The same horns signaled the start of night duty. The same officers inspected the same positions with the same predictable cadence. And while predictability is a defender's comfort, it is also an attacker's blueprint. The more he observed, the more he understood that the fortress wasn't just physically strong, it was psychologically insulated. The defenders trusted their structure so completely that they had grown numb to subtle changes, the kind of changes that only mattered once it was too late. When small anomalies began appearing outside the walls, they didn't adjust their patterns, they simply ignored them, convinced the walls could handle anything. That was his opening. One night, a guard reported hearing footsteps in the ravine. Another claimed a supply cart had been moved 6 inches from where it had been stored. Officers dismissed these as tricks of the imagination, yet each report triggered a small ripple of uneasy cracks in the fortresses. Psychological armor. Cracks that would widen dramatically once the commander unleashed the next phase of his plan. Because while everyone else believed the fortress was unbeatable from the outside, he was quietly turning it into a battlefield of the mind. Not by attacking the walls, but by attacking the certainty that kept those walls strong. And once certainty begins to erode, even a fortress with a century of victories behind it can collapse faster than anyone imagines. What no one realized was that the commander had already shifted his entire operation from physical confrontation to psychological domination, and the defenders were participating in that battle without even knowing they had been drawn into it. Their strongest advantage had become the very weakness he needed, and soon the legend of the fortress would face a threat it had never encountered: doubt. From the moment he first studied the fortress through his field scope, the commander realized he was facing more than architecture. He was facing a belief system. Most commanders would have tried to break that belief with brute force, with rows of cannons or waves of infantry. But he had learned long ago that belief cannot be shattered by steel. It collapses under the weight of uncertainty. And uncertainty was the one weapon no army had ever brought to the gates of that fortress. He was not born into military brilliance. In his early career, he had been dismissed as overly analytical, too willing to question the tactics everyone else simply obeyed. While others memorized battle formations, he dissected them. While others accepted standard procedure, he asked why it was standard in the first place. His curiosity irritated his superiors, but it also gave him an instinct no textbook could teach: the ability to see patterns where others saw Cassandra vulnerabilities, where others saw strength. Years before he faced the fortress, he had suffered a disastrous defeat. Ambushed in terrain he thought he controlled, he watched his men fall one by one as a supposedly inferior enemy used deception to fracture his lines. That humiliation marked him deeply. He realized then that technology, firepower, and numbers were never the true determining factors of a battle. The real battleground was perception. Whoever controlled what the other side believed had already won half the war. From that moment forward, he studied not just military history, but psychology, human behavior, the way fear spreads through a unit, the subtle cues that cause disciplined soldiers to question their orders. He became obsessed with the invisible forces that shape conflict, the forces that textbooks rarely discuss. And as his reputation grew, senior officers either admired him or feared him. Some said he was brilliant. Others said he was dangerous. All agreed he was unpredictable. That unpredictability became his greatest weapon. When he was assigned to capture the impenetrable fortress, his advisors expected him to demand artillery, engineers, naval support, anything that might give him a traditional advantage. Instead, he refused nearly every resource offered to him. He redirected supply wagons away from the front line. He ignored suggestions for building siege ramps. He dismissed proposals for tunneling. At one point, an officer asked him bluntly, "Are we even planning to fight?" The commander smiled and said, "Yes, but not the fight they expect." He spent his nights observing the terrain, the moonlight angles, the sound of wind against the walls. He watched how shadows played across the battlements at different hours. He timed the rhythm of the guards' footsteps. He noted the exact minute each signal torch was lit. Every soldier in the fortress believed they were operating flawlessly, and they were according to their own standards. But flawless repetition is predictable repetition, and predictable repetition is a blueprint for exploitation. The commander filled his notebooks with sketches and annotations, not diagrams of attack formations, but diagrams of human behavior, where guards looked when they were bored, when their postures sagged from fatigue, how long it took for suspicion to fade after a false alarm. These details mattered more to him than any measurement of the walls. "You can outflank a formation," I often said, "but you cannot outflank fear once it takes root." What set him apart was not arrogance, but awareness. He understood that by the time soldiers see an enemy army on the horizon, the real battle has already begun, days or even weeks earlier inside their minds, in the silent assumptions no one examines. His staff officers still questioned him, whispering concerns that their commander had lost touch with reality. Some believed he was courting disaster. But then the early disturbances began to unsettle the garrison. Reports of strange movements, misplaced objects, conflicting messages, subtle inconsistencies, nothing threatening, yet nothing ignorant. The defenders were experiencing something new, unease without a source, and the commander knew this was only the first crack. Every night he escalated the psychological tension just enough to disrupt the defenders' equilibrium, but not enough to expose his intent. He wanted them confused, not alerted. He wanted them questioning their senses, not reinforcing their guards. His strategy resembled a slow tightening of a rope, gentle at first, then increasingly impossible to escape. His officers, those who had mocked his refusal to use conventional tactics, not in the fortress walls, but in the fortress spirit. The garrison was no longer confidently patrolling. They were nervously reacting, no longer trusting their routines. They were doubting their own eyes. And once doubt enters a fortress, it spreads through corridors faster than fire. The commander wasn't attacking the stronghold. He was transforming it from the inside out. And he knew the moment was approaching when he would need to weaponize their fear in a way that would push the entire garrison to the edge, still keep them unaware that the real attack had not even begun. The deeper the commander studied the fortress, the more he understood that its strength was not its walls, its cannons, or its soldiers. It was the belief that no enemy would dare challenge it. That belief had survived decades of warfare. But belief is a fragile thing when the world begins to behave in ways that defy logic. And that is exactly what the commander intended to exploit. He wasn't preparing an infiltration of bodies. He was preparing an infiltration of ideas. His next move began not with soldiers, but with silence. Silence can be more unsettling than noise. It forces the mind to search for patterns where none exist. So he ordered his men to withdraw from visible positions, creating the illusion that the disturbances had ceased. For 2 nights, nothing happened. No strange footprints, no flickering lights, no shifting shadows. The defenders relaxed slightly, interpreting the earlier incidents as isolated mistakes. That tiny window relief was exactly what the commander needed, because a soldier who calms down becomes vulnerable to a sudden spike in tension. On the 3rd night, he initiated the 2nd phase. He sent small detachments to move through the terrain at angles the fortress towers could not fully cover, taking advantage of blind spots created by the moon's position. But rather than approaching the walls, they remained at a distance where their shapes were visible only enough to provoke uncertainty. They made no sound, no signal, not a single hostile movement. Sentries would catch glimpses of figures in the dark too far to identify, too close to ignore. When torches shined on the fields, nothing seemed out of place. Yet every few minutes, someone reported seeing motion. The purpose was not to approach the fortress, but to approach the defenders' imagination. The commander understood that the human mind, once exposed to ambiguity, fills the gaps with worst-case scenarios. He wanted the defenders to sense a presence they couldn't confirm, a threat they couldn't describe, an enemy they couldn't locate. Fear of the unknown is far more powerful than fear of the known, because the unknown never holds still long enough to be confronted. Then he introduced a subtle but critical pattern break. A small team circled the fortress and lit a single lantern at a distance impossible for the defenders to reach quickly. It remained lit for exactly 3 minutes before being extinguished. Another terre, it reappeared on the opposite side. Another hour later, it moved again. The defenders had never seen such behavior from an enemy. Patrols were dispatched. Orders conflicted. Officers debated whether it was a signal, a decoy, or simply a prank. Inside the walls, the atmosphere shifted. Soldiers who had once stood proudly began muttering among themselves. Some believed spies were already inside the fortress. Others suspected traitors. The commander had aimed to fracture their confidence, and now the cracks were widening. But the most effective blow came from something simple: misaligned expectations. The defenders were trained to react to sieges, artillery barrages, cavalry charges, not to psychological erosion. Their playbook offered no guidance on how to fight shadows that disappeared when challenged, or lanterns that moved without pattern. Their strict routines, once their strength, now trapped them. Every time they attempted to respond, their own structure worked against them. Officers demanded discipline. Soldiers demanded answers. Neither group received what they needed. The commander watched these reactions unfold with quiet satisfaction. His plan wasn't about frightening the enemy, it was about exhausting their discipline. When a garrison becomes mentally overloaded, it starts interpreting information emotionally rather than rationally. It begins expecting danger in every direction. It reacts instead of planning, and, most importantly, it becomes desperate for clarity. Desperation is the most dangerous emotion a fortress can feel, because it makes surrender seem not like defeat, but like relief. Still, this phase was only preparation. What he needed next was a shift so dramatic, so psychologically disorienting, that the defenders would begin to lose trust in their own command structure. Fear is powerful, but internal distrust is fatal. And deep inside the fortress, tensions were already rising in ways no wall, cannon, or gate could defend against. Inside the fortress, this psychological pressure was no longer an invisible tremor. It was becoming a structural fault line. The defenders still believed their walls were impenetrable, but they no longer believed in each other. And that shift, subtle at first, was precisely what the commander had been orchestrating. He had spent days feeding them uncertainty, and uncertainty is a poison that spreads without sound. By the time anyone notices its effects, it has already reached the command center. It began with a dispute between two sentries on the northern wall. One insisted he saw figures moving just beyond the boundary of the torches. The other insisted the movement was within the fortress, behind their own barrack. Their commanding officer dismissed both accounts, but the argument lingered. By dawn, 24 soldiers were whispering different versions of the same story, some claiming infiltrators had breached the courtyard, others claiming spies had disguised themselves among the garrison. What none of them realized was that nothing had actually happened. The commander's plan relied not on action, but on implication. The next night, during the third watch, a guard was found unconscious beside a staircase. He had fainted from exhaustion, but rumors quickly turned the incident into something else. Some swore he had been struck. Others claimed he had been dragged. Someone insisted they saw footprints leading away from the scene. Though the prince vanished by morning, officers launched an internal investigation, which only fueled suspicion. The fortress, once a unified body, was now a collection of nerves firing in different directions, and the commander kept tightening the rope. At key moments, his men created faint disturbances, never enough to confirm an enemy's presence, always enough to provoke disagreement. A dropped stone near the gatehouse, a whisper carried by the wind, a torch briefly flaring twice, as if signaling someone. Each event was trivial on its own, but when layered on top of sleepless nights, conflicting reports, and growing distrust, the effect became explosive. Within the walls, tempers rose. Officers accused subordinates of negligence. Subordinates accused officers of hiding information. A lieutenant claimed he overheard two sergeants speaking in hushed tones about a shadow figure inside the fortress. Soldiers began keeping weapons closer to their beds. One unit requested permission to conduct a full sweep of the fortress interior. Another unit opposed it, arguing that such an action would cause panic. By this point, the defenders were no longer worrying about an external attack. They were worrying about internal collapse, the one scenario they had never trained for. The commander, observing from the ridgeline with silent satisfaction, knew this was the transformation he needed. The fortress was still intact physically, but mentally it had begun to fracture. A fortress that distrusts itself can no longer function as a single organism. It becomes unpredictable, hesitant, and prone to turning minor incidents into major threats. Then came the breaking point. A patrol returning from the western corridor reported that one of the signal torches had been lit earlier than scheduled. The officer responsible for lighting it swore he had not touched it. Another soldier claimed he saw someone near the tower, someone who didn't belong to their garrison. The commanders dismissed the incident as a mistake, but the soldiers didn't believe them. That night, half the fortress slept with their boots on, convinced something was moving among them. In reality, nothing had changed on the outside. The commander had not advanced a single troop, had not fired a single weapon, had not breached a gate or scaled a wall, but the defenders were already fighting a battle they couldn't describe, a battle they feared was coming from inside their own ranks. Every whisper became a threat. Every shadow became a warning. Every inconsistent report felt like a precursor to disaster. The fortress's greatest strength, its absolute competence, had now mutated into its most dangerous weakness. The defenders were so accustomed to stability that once instability took root, they had no mental framework to contain it. They spiraled. They improvised. They argued. They hesitated. And hesitation is the first step towards surrender. The commander was prepared to exploit this moment with a precision strike, not against the fortress, but against the defenders' collective psyche. One perfectly timed action could push them from fear into panic, from panic into desperation, and from desperation into the unthinkable, lowering their weapons voluntarily. But for now, he waited, letting their imagination continue the work his men had started. After all, the most powerful enemy inside a fortress is the one that doesn't exist. The commander knew that fear alone would not break the fortress. Fear makes soldiers alert, jumpy, reactive, but still willing to fight. What he needed was something far more distinct. He needed the defenders to believe with absolute certainty that they were already defeated, even though no enemy had touched their gates. And that meant creating an illusion so complete, so immersive, that it didn't merely deceive their eyes, it rewired their expectations. His first step was to analyze how soldiers interpret danger. Troops rarely panic from what they see. They panic from what they cannot explain. So instead of staging a physical attack, he began shaping an invisible one. He assigned small groups to operate in isolated patterns around the fortress, but never in ways that suggested a conventional army. No banners, no formations, no torches arranged in lines. Instead, movements were staggered, inconsistent, seemingly chaotic. One moment, a glint of metal flashed from a ridge. Another moment, a faint echo bounced off the stone walls. These inconsistencies were designed to evade classification. If the defenders could not categorize the threat, they could not counter it. But this was only the foundation. The true brilliance came when he manipulated timing, sound, and light to simulate a force much larger than his own. At specific hours, his men positioned mirrors to catch moonlight and cast brief reflections across the battlements. To the fortress guards, these looked like signals passing between units. At other moments, small groups marched in shallow valleys where the terrain distorted footsteps, multiplying them into the sound of a battalion moving through the dark. Nothing lasted long. Everything was fleeting. The defenders were left with fragments, glimpses, echoes, impressions, their minds filled in the rest. Then the commander escalated further. He ordered controlled fires set in 3 separate locations, miles apart. Each fire was small enough to be extinguished quickly, but large enough to be seen from the fortress walls. To the defenders, this implied the gathering of multiple encampments. The fires were arranged deliberately out of sync. First one, then another later, then none for hours, then 2 at once, never forming a pattern. This chaos created the illusion not just of numbers, but of coordination among unseen units. The defenders' scouts, unsure what they were witnessing, returned with contradictory reports. One claimed he saw hundreds of men. Another insisted the fires were decoy. A third reported hearing horses, though no tracks were found. Their commander tried to reconcile the accounts, but each new piece of information only added confusion. A fortress can withstand siege engines, hunger, and bombardment, but it cannot withstand uncertainty, crumbling its decision-making hierarchy. Meanwhile, inside the walls, tension pulled tighter. Officers held emergency meetings late into the night. Messages were rewritten 3 or 4 times before being delivered. Sentries rotated positions more frequently, not because protocol demanded it, but because they couldn't trust themselves to remain alert. The psychological fatigue the commander had ceded earlier was now accelerating at a speed they could no longer control. The true masterstroke, however, came when the commander exploited sound. His soldiers were ordered to perform irregular movements through narrow valleys at dawn, when mist muffled visibility but amplified low-frequency noise. To the defenders high above, the faint rumble resembled the distant march of an army far larger than anything the commander actually possessed. And because the sound emerged from changing directions, the defenders were convinced the enemy was surrounding them. By this point, the illusion was no longer something the commander maintained. It had become something the defenders reinforced through their own fear. Every torch that flickered unexpectedly became a signal. Every night, birds startled from a tree became a scouting party. Every gust of wind became movement in the brush. They could not distinguish their imagination from reality, and the commander was counting on that. In psychological warfare, the moment the enemy begins deceiving itself is the moment true control begins. And yet, the illusion was still incomplete. To force the fortress to collapse without a single shot fired, the defenders needed to believe not just that they were outnumbered, but that they were already defeated strategically. The commander had to deliver a final maneuver that would push them from confusion into absolute resignation. A maneuver bold enough to shatter the last fragments of their confidence. That decisive step was coming, and it would unfold on a single night when the fortress, already teetering on the edge, would finally lose its grip on reality. The fortress had survived countless campaigns, stood unbroken against artillery, starvation, and siege engines. Yet, nothing in its long history had prepared it for this night, the moment when silence became more terrifying than cannon fire, and shadows carried more weight than armies. The defenders were exhausted, stretched thin by sleeplessness and doubt. Their once rigid formation had softened into a jittery, reactive force, waiting for danger they could feel but could no longer identify. The commander knew the time had come. Everything he had engineered, every whisper of uncertainty, every flicker of illusion had led to this precise hour. The night began with unnatural stillness. No wind scraped across the battlements. No birds cried from the trees. Even the usual creaking of timbers seemed to pause. The defenders paced along the walls, trying to interpret the eerie calm. Some said it meant the enemy had left. Others whispered that it meant the enemy had arrived. Uncertainty had reshaped that fortress into a maze of conflicting theories. And in that confusion, the commander initiated his boldest deception yet. At the stroke of midnight, torches ignited in 2 distant valleys. Sharp bursts of light that vanished just as quickly as they appeared. Then, moments later, faint echoes drifted across the hills, not loud enough to identify, but rhythmic enough to suggest organized movement. Within minutes, the fortress was alive with speculation. Scouts were dispatched, only to return with contradictory accounts. One claimed the lights were signals, another insisted they were reflections, another said he heard marching, another swore it was only wind. The commander watched from the ridge, letting the fortress drown in its own interpretations. He knew that fear is never strongest when an enemy is seen. It is strongest when an enemy might be everywhere at once. And tonight, he wanted the defenders to believe they were surrounded. To deepen the illusion, he had his men create controlled disturbances near the base of the cliffs. A few scattered stones rolled down the slopes, A snapped branch echoed unnaturally in the cold night air. These faint signs made sentries believe something was creeping closer. Every guard on duty shifted their stance, tightening their grip on spears or rifles. Breath plumed in the cold. Eyes darted toward sound. The psychological net was closing, and the commander pressed further. He ordered a series of synchronized movements that relied entirely on timing, not force. Small units passed through narrow ravines to generate layered acoustics footsteps that multiplied when bouncing off stone, creating the illusion of hundreds. Elsewhere, soldiers raised shields in slow, deliberate rhythms to reflect moonlight in brief flashes, mimicking the glint of armor. These glimpses and echoes accumulated until the defenders could no longer determine where the threat was strongest. Inside the fortress, panic simmered. Officers barked, conflicting orders. Messengers sprinted through hallways, carrying instructions that changed faster than they could be communicated. The chain of command, once absolute, was now an unstable web. No one trusted the information they received. No one trusted the silence either. And then the commander delivered the decisive psychological strike. He had a single horn blown from deep within a valley, a long, low note that lingered ominously before fading into the night. Moments later, the same horn call echoed from another direction. Then another. Each sound was separated by distance, but connected by intention. To the defenders, it signaled one terrifying conclusion. Coordinated enemy units were closing in from multiple sides. It didn't matter that the commander had only a few horn players. The darkness did the rest. The fortress erupted into chaos. Soldiers rushed to battlements. Officers shouted for formations. Others demanded the gates be reinforced. But no attack came. The horns fell, silent. The echoes faded. The night returned to its unnatural stillness, leaving the garrison trembling with anticipation. They were certain an assault was imminent, but the enemy never appeared. This was the exact moment the commander had planned for. The defenders were now fighting an invisible opponent, one that attacked their nerves, not their walls. Every second they waited for an assault that never came, drained their morale further. Fatigue sharpened into paranoia, paranoia sharpened into dread, and dread, left unchecked, would lead them exactly where the commander needed them to go. The fortress was not crumbling from the outside. It was collapsing inward, one heartbeat at a time, as the defenders' confidence dissolved into fear of the unseen. By dawn, the fortress looked the same from the outside: massive walls, commanding towers, the proud silhouette of a stronghold that had never bowed to an enemy. But inside, the collapse had already begun. Exhausted soldiers leaned against stone walls, eyes hollow from fear that had stretched through too many sleepless nights. Officers whispered among themselves, debating scenarios they would have once mocked as paranoia. The fortress's physical structure was unchanged, but its psychological structure was cracking like ice under pressure. The commander had predicted this moment with near mathematical precision. He knew the defenders' nerves were stretched to the breaking point. He knew they were expecting a devastating assault, and he knew that the absence of that assault was doing far more damage than an actual attack ever could. Because when an enemy attacks, soldiers react with instinct. But when an enemy doesn't attack, soldiers are forced to react with imagination. Imagination is a far more dangerous battlefield. To push the fortress past the break-in threshold, the commander now needed only one more element: the illusion of inevitability. Not the threat of attack, but the feeling that resistance was already pointless. He sent out a small team not to storm the gates, but to position themselves in plain sight at a distance that suggested confidence. They carried no siege weapons, no banners, no visible reinforcements. They simply stood there, as if waiting for something. This calm display confused the defenders more than any aggressive maneuver could have. If the enemy had surrounded them, why weren't they advancing? If they hadn't surrounded them, why did they act as if victory was assured inside the fortress? Speculation boiled over. Some soldiers believed the enemy had reinforcements hidden in the forest. Others believed spies had infiltrated the fortress and sabotaged their defenses. One officer suggested the enemy was preparing a catastrophic attack of a kind they had never encountered. Another believed they were being encircled by forces far larger than anything they could see. But the most devastating rumor was the one no officer dared say aloud, that the fortress was already lost. Rumors spread quickly in closed spaces. Panic spreads even faster. Soldiers gathered in small groups, exchanging stories that grew more dramatic with each retelling. Someone claimed the enemy had cut off their water supply. Someone else insisted the enemy had tunneled beneath the walls. None of these things were true, but truth was no longer relevant. Perception had taken control. Then the final blow came not from the commander, but from inside the fortress itself. During a tense officers' meeting, two commanders argued over the proper response to the supposed incident. Their disagreement escalated until one openly accused the other of negligence. Voices rose. Swords were drawn. The meeting ended abruptly, but the damage was done. Soldiers nearby heard fragments of the argument and interpreted them as proof that leadership had lost control. Moments later, a miscommunication between two units led one group to believe the gates needed reinforcing while another believed the gates were compromised. These orders clashed violently in the courtyard, causing shouting, shoving, and panic that spilled into surrounding corridors. What had once been the most disciplined garrison in the region was now a fractured battalion acting without coordination. Watching from afar, the commander saw exactly what he needed: a fortress collapsing under the weight of its own confusion. He gave a single, simple command, one that would define the climax of the entire operation. His men approached the fortress slowly, openly, carrying no weapons in hand. They stopped just outside range of the archers and waited. They didn't shout threats. They didn't demand surrender. They simply existed silent, calm, unthreatened by the towering walls before them. The defenders saw this and panicked. Why would an enemy behave like this? Unless they knew something the defenders didn't, why would they stand so boldly unless the fortress was surrounded by forces invisible to the eye? Every soldier on the wall imagined an entire army lurking behind the hillside, waiting for the signal to attack. But there was no army. There was only belief. And belief, once distorted, becomes a weapon more powerful than any cannon. Inside the fortress, the commander of the garrison faced a horrifying realization. If he ordered a fight, his exhausted, panicked soldiers might break instantly. If he hesitated, chaos would consume the fortress from within. And if the enemy truly had encircled them, resistance would lead to slaughter. So he made the decision no one believed was possible. He raised the white flag. The defenders, terrified, confused, desperate for stability, laid down their weapons. Gates were opened. Soldiers stepped aside, and the enemy walked in without firing a single shot, claiming victory over a fortress that had stood undefeated for a century. A fortress defeated not by force, but by perception. When news of the fortress's surrender began spreading, it traveled faster than any army ever could. Messengers carried the report in disbelief. Officers reread dispatches, assuming some detail must have been omitted, and generals across the region demanded clarification. A fortress known for its flawless record one that had survived artillery bombardments, winter sieges, and assaults from armies far larger than the commanders had capitulated without suffering a single structural breach. Not a crack in the wall, not a burn mark on the gate, not even a broken arrow shaft. The military establishment, both friend and foe, was stunned. It was the kind of event that forced strategists to question everything they believed about warfare. If a fortress could fall without being attacked, then what did strength even mean? If walls and cannons and manpower could be rendered irrelevant by invisible pressure, then every army in the world had far more to fear from uncertainty than from enemy fire. Some generals immediately rejected the report. They insisted it was fabricated propaganda designed to humiliate rival armies. They claimed the garrison must have been bribed or infiltrated or weakened by disease. The idea that psychological manipulation alone could break a fortress was unthinkable to men who had spent their entire careers worshipping physical force. But as more details emerged, as survivors from the fortress recounted their sleepless nights and the gradual descent into paranoia, denial became harder to maintain. Soon, scholars began studying the event like an unsolved riddle. Military academies requested transcripts of the surrender. Analysts dissected every reported disturbance, every horn call, every flicker of torchlight. They pored over timelines, trying to determine the exact moment the defenders' resolve had cracked. Yet the true brilliance of the operation lay in something that couldn't be measured: its fluidity. The commander had not executed a rigid plan. He had adapted in real time, responding to psychological shifts, the way a battlefield surgeon responds to changes in a patient's pulse. It was unconventional warfare at its highest level. Foreign armies, fearing similar tactics, began reforming their training programs. Officers were instructed not only in engineering and artillery, but in perception management, stress response, rumor control, and the psychology of group decision. New manuals were drafted emphasizing unpredictability as both a weapon and a threat. And while most governments never openly admitted it, many secretly commissioned studies on how to defend against the kind of invisible siege the commander had pioneered. But perhaps the most dramatic reaction came from those who had long believed war was a purely physical contest. These were the traditionalists, proud defenders of fortress warfare. To them, the idea that a massively fortified structure could be undone by whispers, shadows, and coordinated illusions was an insult to centuries of military engineering. They protested loudly, insisting that no fortress could fall without treachery. Some demanded the garrison be punished. Others refused to accept the surrender as legitimate, claiming fear was no excuse for capitulation. Yet eyewitness testimonies from inside the fortress were too consistent to ignore. Soldiers described nights of confusion so intense they no longer trusted their own senses. Officers admitted they had given contradictory orders because information had become impossible to verify. Several recounted moments when they felt surrounded by an invisible enemy even though they never saw a single opposing soldier. Their descriptions painted a picture not of cowardice, but of psychological overload, a state in which the human mind becomes the battlefield itself. This terrified military leaders everywhere. If a commander could win without sacrificing troops, if he could shatter an enemy's will using only perception, then traditional war was no longer the only threat. Every fortress, no matter how well constructed, now had to contend with battles fought in silence, under moonlight, in the minds of its defender. Even the most impregnable stronghold could be undone not by force, but by doubt. Some nations tried to replicate the commander's methods. Most failed. They focused on the tricks, the horns, the torches, the scattered movements without understanding the deeper strategy. The commander had not relied on gimmicks. He had relied on insight. He understood the defenders better than they understood themselves. He recognized that belief, once distorted, becomes fragile, and once belief breaks, no wall can hold. The operation became a case study in military innovation. It marked the dawn of a new era in Warfare 1, where psychological operations were no longer side strategies, but central weapons. Generals began acknowledging something they had resisted for decades: that wars are not won only by killing the enemy, but by breaking the enemy's SI capacity to resist. Yet even as military academies rewrote their doctrines, one question remained unanswered. How had the commander known his plan would succeed? What gave him the confidence to attempt something so radical, so unprecedented, so easily dismissed as madness? The answer lay in the final piece of the story, the truth behind the so-called stupid strategy that would change the future of war forever. When the commander finally revealed the logic behind his operation, many officers, both allied and enemy, realized they had misunderstood the very nature of war. They had mocked his refusal to assemble siege engines, laughed when he rejected heavy artillery, and whispered doubts when he spent nights observing instead of planning assaults. But the truth was that he had never intended to fight the fortress directly. He intended to make the fortress fight itself, and the brilliance of his plan lay not in the individual tricks he used, but in the sequence, timing, and psychological layering that turned ambiguity into a weapon. He explained that a fortress is not defeated when its walls fall. It is defeated the moment its defenders no longer believe those walls can save them. So instead of attacking stone, he attacked belief. Instead of striking the gates, he struck their expectations. Instead of overwhelming them with force, he overwhelmed them with interpretation. He understood long before military doctrine acknowledged it that humans are wired to overreact to uncertainty. When the brain cannot categorize a threat, it creates one. When soldiers cannot trust their senses, they cannot trust their decisions. And when decisions crumble, defense collapses without ever being breached. The commander revealed that every illusion, every echo, horn, call, flickering torch, and shifting shadow had been calibrated to disrupt specific mental anchors the defenders relied upon. Their routines were not just habits, they were the skeleton of their confidence. By destabilizing those routines slowly, subtly, and relentlessly, he eroded the foundation on which discipline rested. When discipline falters, fear spreads. When fear spreads, logic dissolves. The fortress did not surrender to him. It surrendered to its own unraveling. He also disclosed something that stunned even his closest officers. He had deliberately kept his own troops in the dark about the full extent of the plan. Only a few knew the real objective. This ensured that no accidental hint or careless assumption would reach the defenders through captured conversations or intercepted signals. His rank-and-file soldiers believed they were preparing for a conventional assault. Their natural movements, their genuine uncertainty, and their disciplined restraint all contributed to the authenticity of the illusion. According to the commander, the key to victory was not deception, it was controlled inevitability. He wanted the defenders to conclude on their own that defeat was unavoidable. A threatened soldier fights. A doomed soldier capitulates. Therefore, he built a narrative the defenders themselves completed. Their own imaginations became the siege engines he never brought. He had studied human stress responses, group panic patterns, and the fragility of hierarchical communication under pressure. He knew that once contradictory reports reached critical mass, the chain of command would buckle. Once officers contradicted each other, soldiers would lose trust in orders. Once trust eroded, cohesion dissolved, and once cohesion dissolved, even the strongest walls became meaningless. He had counted on their discipline becoming rigidity and the rigidity becoming a trap. What shocked historians most was not the boldness of his strategy, but its restraint. He had refused unnecessary violence, not out of mercy, but out of precision. A fired shot would have revealed positions. A dead defender would have clarified the threat. Clarity was the enemy of his design. Ambiguity was the blade he wielded more effectively than any sword or cannon. In the years that followed, many attempted to replicate his method, but few succeeded. They tried copying the external actions while ignoring the internal architecture of the plan. The commander had not relied on tricks that frightened the defenders. He relied on rhythms that destabilized their ability to interpret the world. Without understanding the psychology behind these rhythms, imitation became a hollow performance. His genius was not that he fooled the fortress, but that he guided it step by step toward fooling itself. Decades later, military academies rewrote entire chapters of their doctrine based on his operation. They emphasized adaptability, mental resilience, and the dangers of overconfidence. They studied how belief systems form, how they stabilize, and how quickly they fracture under targeted pressure. And they recognized the uncomfortable truth his victory exposed, that human perception is the most critical battlefield of all. Even today, strategists still debate the ethical implications of what he accomplished. Was it brilliance or manipulation? Was it humane or insidious? Did he save lives by avoiding open combat, or did he weaponize the defenders' minds in a way that forever changed the rules of war? The answers depend on one's perspective. But one fact remains indisputable. The fortress fell without a single shot, and the world of warfare was never the same again. The man whose plan was once dismissed as stupid left behind a legacy that reshaped military theory. And perhaps the most astonishing part is this: he proved that the greatest victories are not won by overpowering the enemy, but by making the enemy abandon the fight long before the battle ever begins. If you made it here, you saw how strategy, psychology, and perception collided to rewrite history. Now tell me. Comment: perception defeats power. So I know you watched until the end. And if this exploration opened your eyes to a new side of warfare, make sure to subscribe, leave a like to support the channel, and don't miss the next video waiting for you on screen. It continues the hidden history of strategies that shaped entire civilizations.